And then next we're gonna go into sgraffito. So sgraffito is actually one of my favorite techniques. This can create really, really awesome pieces. It is quite a bit more time consuming, so you need to be patient with it. So this is my example of sgraffito from before. So essentially, if you think about those like little kid toys that you used to get, or I guess I shouldn't say toys, or activities, where you have this black paper and you have this fancy tool, and when you scratch into it, it shows like color through it, or it shows white, also known as scratch board. Sgraffito is also another term that points towards that. So sgraffito is when you layer a dark color on top of a light color using various tools to scratch through the dark layer to reveal an underlying color. So in this one, I had yellow throughout the entire shape. And then on top, I had blue, I had brown, I had red, and I even added more blue and red towards the top as well. And when I scratched through, that yellow showed. So first and foremost, you're gonna pick your light color or colors. You don't wanna make this huge because this is, yes, time consuming. I would also stray you away from using white. You can, and it's totally fine if you do. It just does mix with the color that you add on top a little too easily, and then you just get a whole kind of like grayish colored sticking out. So I would maybe stick towards your lighter color. So I'm going to add in some yellow. You also don't need to worry too much about filling in every single little paper gap. And I know I told you do not blend with your finger. This is the only case. Buffing and sgraffito is the only case that I'll ever let you use your finger. And if you're weird about texture, feel free to just use a paper towel because I want this to be a thinner layer. And even doing this, I feel like I'm doing something wrong, but I just want this to be a thin layer of yellow that will show through, kind of filling in some of those paper bits without getting the yellow too thick. And then I'm gonna maybe switch to pink, or sorry, my peachy color. And if you've been doing buffing before, make sure to clean off your finger or else it might transfer some of that color in. I'm gonna get this a little thicker, and you can experiment with maybe making it thicker towards one side for the underneath color and thinner towards another. And then I'm gonna finish off with my blue. So all of this is gonna be underneath some color. And obviously my blue is obviously darker than my peach or my yellow. So don't stress about that. It is gonna be a little bit stronger. And I would rather you guys try to fill in more of those paper bits with the darker color. That yellow will show through no matter what. Doesn't matter if it's not beautiful, okay? So now I'm gonna layer some darker colors on top. The colors that would constitute as darker are going to be obviously your black, which I will show you, possibly red or violet. Violet's a little tricky because it does kind of blend a little funny because it's not super opaque. And then your earth tones can also be a really cool use for this technique. So first and foremost, I'm gonna add black. And I'm gonna do this over top of all three colors just so you can see it. And remember, we are covering this to cover it, not to blend it. So that's kind of the tricky part when you start adding colors on top, is because you're gonna want to blend it. Try not to. I'm gonna go back and forth, maybe a little bit in a couple of directions. I just wanna be able to show you what it looks like with black on top. But there are so many variations that don't just use black. I'm gonna add some blue. Yes, the blue will have a slight yellow or a green tint to it because yellow and blue make green. I'm gonna try to cover up this edge over here. And obviously on top of the light blue, the dark blue probably won't stand out as much just because they're so similar. Now I'm gonna come in with the red. You can experiment with this however you may want. I'm just doing stripes just so that you can see the differences between multiple colors. You can use my first example for inspiration too, thinking about how you might use this. I've had people who have done pieces that have like jeans, and they did the texture of jeans with this technique. And I've had other people do like trees or grass, because obviously grass is a difficult thing to show. And since we are going to be working on a landscape project, grass might be an easier one to do. All right, last but not least, I'm going to come in with the brown and cover this up. And you can cover all of the underbits if you want, or you can leave it a little bit textured, but it does have the best effect when you cover these. So now I'm going to come back in with my fancy tools, such as my pen cap and my paper clip. Paper clips are tricky for this because sometimes it pulls out too much color and doesn't turn out as well. So I'll just show you with the paper clip how this might look. And clean between each pass because it will make things easier. So you can come in here. It actually turns out pretty well. And we'll go another pass. So the peach is very subtle. It almost looks white. And the blue is also pretty subtle. Nothing too crazy. This also can work to add in texture. So you can use your pen cap in many different ways. Like if I want to come in and do hatching, remember cleaning it off between will help. So essentially what you are doing is scraping away the top layer of color, revealing the under layer of color. And yes, the top layer will affect the under layer, but you should still have an effect. And maybe I want to clear out a bigger area or think about line weight. Remember, you can create line weight with any tool and any material. So maybe I want to play around with line weight. Maybe I want to play around specifically with line and just see how that might turn out. Or even, let's even play with like little squiggles. Play around with little squiggles, moving through. So you can see how this might result in a cool technique. So say I want to play around with like a grass texture. I can come in here using my pen cap and a different pressure. I can go from thick to thin. Remember, pressure is key for any technique. So once you've done playing around with that, you can go on to the next one, which will be scumbling. So scumbling is honestly one of my favorite techniques with oil pastel because it doesn't have as many rules. It's a little messier and it can create some really cool effects. So my example for scumbling is right here. So it sounds just like what it is. Scumbling, or it's a fancy term for scribbling, okay? So scumbling is using scribble marks to create texture and transition or blending, using figure 8 marks or S marks for the scribble shape, okay? So for scumbling, I really do like this technique because it really does lend itself to create smooth transitions without having to worry, but also you can create some really awesome texture. So, and it also covers a bunch of ground. So I'm gonna transition from light to dark. So I know people have had questions about, what do I do if I wanna transition from light to dark using other colors? This is the perfect time to experiment with this. So you can see it's quick and it's easy. And the key is layering and going back and forth a whole bunch of times. I always, for some reason, love doing this with blues. I think it's just the fact that I really like blue, but you can do this with any color. Note that if you use colors that are not next to each other on the color wheel, yes, they will turn out to be kind of brownish, poopy colors. Because that is what happens when we mix complementary colors or colors across from each other on the color wheel. So I'm going to sink in some red down here. So I'm doing transition from blue to red. So we're going to come back in again with some white. And I'm going to let that transition over top of the blue. And this is not meant to be super, super specific, though you can be really specific with this technique. I'm overlapping over the dark blue. This technique also lends itself to have a smoother transition if you use it in a more, if you do smaller scumble marks. It does help to layer up big and then work your way small. It can really result in some cool stuff. So I'm going to let it overlap into the purple a little bit, and then I'm going to let the purple overlap into it and have the purple overlap into the red as well. So this technique, you just keep layering and layering. And I'm going to fast forward and do a time lapse of this portion so that I don't take up too much of your time.
The key with scumbling is to layer back and forth multiple times. Don't try to do this in one swoop. And don't worry about some of the paper bits showing. It will be just fine. So for the scumbling, you can play around with any colors on top. They can create really fun textures on top of other colors, especially when you have those lighter colors. They can create really, really cool effects. And honestly, in this video, it really doesn't do the color justice, but it really does look nice using the complements on top of its complement color. So orange on top of blue, for example. So for this last portion, you are combining hatching, embossing, sgraffito, stippling, and scumbling. We did stippling in our exercises 1 through 3, but we want to bring it back to play around with texture techniques in this bottom portion. There is no wrong way of how to do this bottom portion. The only wrong way to do it is to not do it. So as you can see, this is my example that I created later in a previous example, but you can see I have my embossing that's happening here. I filled the background and added hatching. I added some stippling. I also added sgraffito over in this area and scumbling with some stippling and hatching on top. And the reason that I didn't want to do this in a demo video is because I didn't want you guys to copy me. I want you to experiment with these techniques like you would maybe use them in your own. It could definitely be a picture or a picture reference of something. You could play around with these techniques. Also, it could totally be abstract, just like our examples up here and here, where you're simply just playing with the textures. So it's really important that you do finish up this last shape. Each one of yours is going to look very, very different, and I want you to experiment and not be afraid of playing with the different techniques that I have shown you this far. So feel free to reach out with any questions.